I'm here very often. But in this, I suppose, the central city, the city that makes me who I am is Bombay, and I arrived there when I was 8 or 9, just before liberalization in 1989. And that's where I grew up, and Bombay used to be India's first literary city. Perhaps it is not so anymore, for reasons that have to do with what has happened to Bombay itself in the last 25 years. But when I was growing up there was a chance, and it was very charming in some ways, that you could sometimes walk out of Churchgate Station and go to Nissim Ezekiel's office. This poet who would work there, very close to Churchgate Station. And there's so many legends of literature, including in many languages. That's another thing which I've always loved about Bombay, that it's a city of English, Hindi, Gujarati, Marathi and Urdu literature. You can go to events in any of these languages, and they exist in, just like the 7 islands of Bombay, there are the 6 or 7 islands of Bombay literature. Absolutely. Some which are joined up by highways and some are not. And you can, if you wish, be part of all these worlds, or be limited to one, and you're always finding new worlds inside Bombay, which feeling of discovery has never left me, even when I go back now. And I suppose that's where I did all my reading, the kind of reading that doesn't just make you a consumer of books, but an agent inside books. You know, the kind of reading that makes you feel, I also want to write books. When I was doing that sort of reading in my life between 13, 14 to my early 20s, Bombay was where I was living, and somehow any imagination I had of writing books also got connected up to that. And I think there's something, it's true for every one of us, there's something about the world of one's childhood that one does not choose, which then kind of chooses you. When you, as an adult, you start to think about what you can do that is interesting in terms of narrative. And that is the power of and beauty of memories for an artist, that it's not, there is a phase in your life when you deliberately set out to find something out, or to pursue somebody, or to get a certain kind of experience. But before that, there's another layer which you had no conscious control over, but which has such a powerful claim on your consciousness. And that was Bombay for me. And strangely enough, so when I got to thinking about writing books about Bombay, there's already so many Bombay novels that it was kind of hard to think of what I could do that would present the city in some kind of new light.
Yes.
And sometimes you have little bits of luck in life, and I remember I used to go very sullenly to work for 2 years. I've been self-employed for 15 years, but for 2 years I used to go to work for Cricket Magazine, just out of university. And one day when I was going in an auto to work, one of the things about Bombay is that people cross the street wherever they like, and
Bhubaneswar too. Yeah.
yes, but also straight in front of cars. And what I especially like to do is stand on dividers in the middle of the road and look around. And standing on one such divider, I saw a very short man, a dwarf, who, you know, a face just flashes past you as you go by, and you never see it again. Another feature of life in a big city. So many faces who you only see once. This face just flashed past, and it was a very good-looking but very short man. And I suddenly found myself thinking, when somebody like that reflects on their life and thinks about what we have got, you know, all of us look at mirrors and think, what did God give us, what did our parents give us, what did life give us? Perhaps you would think that he was doubly cheated, not just singly cheated. In that, one, he was met very short, but two, by the fact of being good-looking, people would always stare at him, and then that would intensify his sense of something being wrong in the world. And I thought, you know, there is something quite nice here, and I began to wonder, when somebody from that size, who's not a child, who's actually a full-grown human being, walks in the world, you know, it's the sort of person whose face gets lost in a crowd, and because you can't see him, who always, in his own telling, you know, he walks on the level of the hips of everyone else. What does it look like to somebody like that? And then I think one of the very nice things about writing novels is that you can have a starting idea, but over the years, as you work on it, your theme becomes deeper. And in this case, at some point, I'd given up my job, and I really had no work. I would just leave home in the morning to wander around the city like an unemployed person. And in Bombay, a lot of people who do not want to face the world by day, for whatever reason, they go to cinema halls to spend 2 or 3 hours there, whiling away their time and getting lost in some other story. And somewhere I began to wonder, wouldn't it be amazing if you could tell a story about a man who, when he walks on the street, always looks up at people, and then when he goes to work, because he works as a projectionist in a cinema, and the beam, the person who's in charge of the beam, always the beam always comes from above you when you are in a cinema hall. So in one half of his life he's below people, in the other half he stands above them, directing something like a god that everybody else clamors to watch, although they do not know who is behind it. And I felt this kind of this anonymity, this powerful anonymity would be a very good point of contrast for a character like that, who feels very needy at one level and enormously fulfilled by another, and for whom the darkness means what light means for people like you and me. For him, darkness is the place where no one can see him and they can only see his work, and he loses his body, and the cinema hall becomes a kind of second body for the character. And there, I think that is the kind of thrill that, as an artist, you suddenly feel that you've hit upon a story that works, that has many layers to it, and now you can begin to build. And in a way, every day you start feeling more and more grateful to your own city for having like such a wide range of life within it, that if you only go out and search, you will find the different elements that make you invent something on your own. And so that for me was the beginning of my life as a Bombay writer.
So you've largely referred to Arzi the Dwarf. We'll also talk about Clouds. I read both the novels, and my takeaway was that your characters are always very anxious. So in Clouds, this therapist who is in his 40s and trying to look for love again or companionship again finds that it is a very difficult task in India. Then there is a parallel narration involving an old couple living in a room in Mumbai, whose son has gone back to Odisha to fight the 2014 assembly elections, and probably somewhere around that timeline. And on behalf of a tribal community, takes on a big corporation. So the parents are always anxious about the son is anxious about his parents. Arzi, as you mentioned, was born with anxieties. He's always had problems regarding his stature. He had lost his girlfriend. He may lose his job. So anxiety all around. So I guess the question that comes up now is, anxiety is not an unusual human emotion, but anxiety which is so heightened and so unceasing, as I see in your novel, is that the sine qua non of life in a big city, especially like Mumbai?
Well, I think that's an interesting reading of my work. I don't quite agree with you to the extent that you can be anxious and say excited at the same time. Excitement also is a kind of, one might say, positive anxiety. And especially in the case of Farhad, whom you mentioned, this Bombay, Parsi, very snooty, anglicized, westernized psychoanalyst. In his case, he's very happy at the same time as we see him anxious, because he's leaving Bombay and going away forever. And actually the very space where he suffered now has a new meaning for him as a place he's going to escape. So he's going to fly out of there. So he wants to wander around the space of his childhood. Without some source of tension, one cannot make a proper story, which is to say, of course, many different kinds of emotional states exist. But if you want to write a story, you must find some place in a human being's life. It's not even as if everybody is anxious all the time, but we can all remember different windows of 3 or 4 months or a year where something happened, where everything in our life seemed to come together in some sort of state where, a lot was at stake in those weeks, those times, those months. And that's the sort of story I've written. One of the difficulties or the challenges of writing novels is not just to do with characters, but with how you control time. What is happening? Does the story take place over a week, a day, a set of years? Some writers move very confidently. You might see something happening, and then when you turn the page, you see the chapter says 10 years later when he was coming back. They are able to jump. I think this is a very interesting way of writing stories. In my case, I like to think of time schemes in books and what is happening and how you experience with your body the sense of time. At one level, there's something very rudimentary about writing. It's just a set of black marks on paper. But what you can do with words is amazing. And even by the way you control language and narrative, you can give people different kinds of time sense. For instance, in Arzi the Dwarf, in the beginning, he has this anxiety because so many things are happening in his life. But when the big revelation of the book appears, and he realizes that the cinema is about to close down, then everything becomes very slow for him, if you remember. He cannot even get through the days. Suddenly time is completely at a standstill. So in that way, I find it very interesting to get these different kinds of tension in characters' heads and try and wind them through a story where readers feel they've been on a kind of journey.
Okay. I've been meaning to ask you this because both your novels are anchored in Mumbai. To an author like you, what is Mumbai? I'm sure it's not just a geographic entity. Is it an imagined community? Is it a destination for aspirations? What is Mumbai?
It's a good question because somebody or the other asks themselves this question every day, including people who have been living there for 30 or 40 years. What I wanted to do in Clouds actually is write about two kinds of Bombay, or Mumbai as you say. The Bombay of the person who's lived there his entire life and feels like he knows it at the back of his hand to the point where he cannot stand it anymore. And the other kind of Bombayite, there is a floating Bombayite, the sort of Bombayite who arrives on the train every day and to live in the city, whether because he knows somebody or wants to work or he's meeting a relative, whatever. And these Bombays kind of coexist without either side completely getting to know the other. No one side can know the other because that would be the opposite of the experience. So I wanted to write a story where somebody who knew something about the city, who was curious about it, could get an experience of both sides of the city by writing about one, a classic South Bombayite who had lived in a very anglicized universe. People of South Bombay think of themselves as living in a different country almost. There would be that kind of experience of Bombay, which is not invalid in its own way. It's not as if this is something so elite or make-believe that this is not true. And then to write about the point of view of somebody who arrives in the city for the first time and cannot understand exactly what is going on. Why do people speak so fast? Maybe even I speak fast as a result of having lived there so many years. I see Ananta nodding in the front row. That I felt this would be a coming together of all the Bombays I knew in one story and in one book. And there are moments in your life as a writer where you feel you have enough energy to put together all your ideas into one frame, and some others where you cut them up and say this piece goes here for the next 2 years, that will be done when I'm 45, or that will be done when I'm 50. So in the case of Clouds, by the very title Clouds, I wanted to give a kind of point of view of Bombay as if seen from the sky. And we all love this. One of the interesting things about life in the 20th century onwards is that all of us know what the world looks like from the clouds because of the experience of aviation and flying, which is not a view that humanity had of their own civilizations before. And don't you feel that sometimes when you look at the shape of human markings on the earth, or the way cities are laid out from above, that's the first time it begins to make sense. Oh, this neighborhood transforms into that. This is where the skyscrapers end and the sea begins and stuff. And somewhere I felt as a kind of tribute to the city which has given me so much, that's what I would try to do.
In the vein of the earlier question, I also want to ask you this because you have, in your novels, ventured out of Mumbai into Bhubaneswar briefly. What is Bhubaneswar to you? And I understand you keep visiting the city from time to time. You also have an interesting perspective briefly referenced in your novel where the young tribal boy has his own thoughts about Bhubaneswar. He feels he has understood Bhubaneswar. So what is Bhubaneswar to you, and what do you think Bhubaneswar is to many Odias who have never visited the place? People in Deogarh, in Sambalpur, in Malkangiri, in Sundargarh, for whom Bhubaneswar is as distant as for somebody who's here in Bhubaneswar has never visited Delhi or Mumbai.
That is a good question, and I think the purpose of fiction is to open out through actual details the experience of the idea that you're talking about, which is that every city has a set of very personal meanings for different people. And in my case, of course, in a way it is home for me. I mean, I think in 10 or 15 years' time, I will be living here as well. I don't care to right now because there are so many things I want to do in the world. But it's a place where my family, my extended family, my past comes from. And 2 or 3 years I lived here when I was 7 or 8. Actually, only a few months ago, I went back to a place in Cuttack I had not been for about 30 years. I grew up on Cantonment Road for 2 or 3 years, living very close to the Mahanadi. And I went with Ananta Mahapatra to the Nautical Maritime Museum, and we drove down that road by the side of the water where there's a deer park, and suddenly so many memories came back to me. So it is like Bombay. Bhubaneswar is also a source of my very early memories of meeting my grandparents for the first time when I was 8 or 9 years old, which is much later for reasons I won't go into now. This happened much later than most children. Actually, it did not occur to me at that time that even your parents are parents, for whatever reason. I know it's one of the strange illusions that only children can have. But to me, it's also a test case for certain kinds of coexistence in India, and for instance, social life in the city. I feel sometimes is on the one hand there are layers where you can have incredibly warm and rich experiences, but it doesn't seem to me as if it's a sort of city where if you meet somebody you would say to them, come home for dinner tomorrow. It seems there is a little more wariness than that about who you can meet, who you can invite home, and in some way I feel whenever it is that I return, or now, this is what I try to change in my own way about daily life in Bhubaneswar. Those who know me in Bhubaneswar should always be able to come home for dinner, which I cook for them myself. And in another way, for a long time, Bombay and Delhi were the wellsprings of my imagination, much more as you also saw in Clouds. I've been able to reconnect to my Oriya past and to my Oriya side, whether it is trying to read very haltingly in a language or wandering around the state. And I'm especially attached to the tribal belt in the south. I have many friends there, and some of the Clouds is about what is going on in that part of the world. I think somehow in Bhubaneswar I feel as if people who live here are disconnected from the entire experience of being Oriya. And from the Bhubaneswar I remember in the 80s to what it is today, I can't accurately say whether it is a larger or a smaller city. In some ways, the imagination of Bhubaneswar has become much, much bigger. So many people where I live have children who work in America, and there's traffic up and down. It's almost as if sometimes New Jersey is a satellite of Bhubaneswar, like Cuttack is. There's not, there may be a giant physical distance between these two places, not necessarily an emotional or mental one. But where Bhubaneswar is in terms of East Indian, the East Indian imagination, or sometimes I wonder, I don't think I have the intellectual resources to do this, and I wonder if an Oriya novelist has. Bhubaneswar is a medieval junction of the maritime world. What was our history when connected up to the history today of Indonesia or Malaysia on that coast? And because of Air Asia now, I think Bhubaneswar has once again started to look east, which I like very much about it. That you can now fly, you always had to go to Delhi in order to go to Indonesia, Jakarta, or Malaysia. Now you can just get out of here, and I imagine in 50 or 60 years, maybe we are much more a part of the wider eastern world and less a part of the north and the west of India. These are the little futures I see, and just recently I think artistically it has become a very rich city. I was here last month and there's the art trail going on. So many Oriya artists live in Delhi, including somebody sitting in the audience, a very close friend of mine, Golak Khandwal, sitting next to my mother over there. I have to say, in some ways, he was my neighbor once in Delhi, and we both took great delight in the idea that we have these two single Oriya men living in adjoining apartments in Delhi and thinking about art, in my case in narrative, in his case in painting, while also, having links back to where we come from.
Cities are changing, they will continue to change, but I was having this discussion about a friend as to where our cities are headed as far as change is concerned, especially in this era of consumerism. I personally feel that all cities are headed in the same direction. You have the same malls, the same restaurants, the same bowling alleys, the same kind of events. Does your novel, either of your novel, capture that sort of a change? Do you regret that change? Do you feel cities they are also able to preserve their individuality?
No, they are. There may be a topmost superficial layer. That's why I think it's always interesting when you go to cities to meet people who live there for a very long time, because their knowledge of transformations in a single road or even sometimes a single building is so vast that perspective is because we live in a time of globalization, there are forces at work that in one sweep can implement, within 6 months there can be a Zara store or a McDonald's in every city, tier 2 or tier 3 city in India, and it might look as if, certainly architecturally I feel that India has become very cookie cutter, that you cannot look with pleasure at a modern Indian building mostly and think what is going on, why is it all air conditioned, why are the fronts glass, why is this the preferred shape of Indian architecture, when if you go back into our traditional forms, there's such an amazing variety. But in my experience, at least the two cities I know very well, they never fail to radiate mystery and meaning for me. I mean, even when I go back, to take an example, and I think that is what is extremely pleasurable of being a writer, is in that you can, when you write stories about a character or a family, you have to give them a 20 or 25 year backstory. And in doing that, you can explore not just the past of a human being, but the past of a city. I want to say this in particular reference to a book I just finished writing, which is coming out in March. It's called Tales of My China Dragon. And unlike my first two books, it's a collection of short stories. And in this case, it's the story of a certain amount of amazing luck which I had, which is that I grew up in a somewhat protected environment. And you must know the same thing. Sometimes in India, it's very hard to move up and down the layers of class. It's not as if you cannot speak to all kinds of people. It's whether you can speak meaningfully to all of them, and whether they take you seriously and you can take them seriously, and you can have a conversation that actually has meaning for both sides, which is not perfunctory on the one side. And
especially, I believe, if you're a child in a middle class home, you have a very sheltered childhood.
Yes. And when I was 30, it was the first time I was able to afford renting a flat of my own in Bombay. It took me that many years. And I went around looking in Bombay, and I've always loved central Bombay, which you pass on the way down to the south and back into the north. And I found a very rundown one-room apartment in a very rundown old building. And everybody else in that building lived 7 or 8 people to the place. And to them, I lived like a prince because I had my room to myself. And sometimes the children would come in and knock on the door, and we'd all chat, and they would ask me what I was doing and stuff. But just below the house, there was this Chinese restaurant. And to answer your question with a reference to a specific example, to me, the Chinese restaurant had been there for a long time. But when I went down and started eating this, we just started last week. And before that, it was an Udupi restaurant for 30 years. I.e., it had a certain relationship to the immediate neighborhood, which was changing, and the proprietor decided, now I think it's time to be a bit more adventurous. How many idlis, dosas, vadas, and sambar can you sell? Let's move to something more exciting and give ourselves as well a new challenge. And in some way, because I was the only person who had been abroad in that entire group of people, I somehow became the reference point for what Chinese could be. Does this really happen in China, or where does this dish come from? And even I had no answer to these questions, but I also became interested in answering them. And together we met this little sort of like fake Chinese world where we all had the greatest time. And to me, it was like I would sit down at night and listen to the stories told by the proprietor of the past of the restaurant when it was an Udupi restaurant, when he himself was growing up and would come. And sometimes after hours, when the customers would go and the shutters would be down, the staff would make food, and there would be all sorts of unusual kinds of quarrels between them. For instance, there was a time when the chef was Bengali and the head waiter was also Bengali. So all the food they made would be Bangla. And much of the waiters were from Maharashtra, and they would hate eating, beguni varta or machar jhol or whatever. This was not food for them. And they would be so unhappy that this would vitiate the atmosphere the next day. And all these small problems of food and how seriously people take food and what they want from food and the meanings attached to food only became real to me, although I've been eating at places like this all my life. They became real to me in connection with the faces of this place. And now, sadly, this place is shut down. It's gone forever. And it seemed to me that the only way I could recreate the memories and the pleasure of those days where, a customer would come in and say, this is the best I've ever eaten, I feel so happy, and everybody would be thrilled, and we would share all our joys together. Sometimes they would cook for me, sometimes I would cook for them. And so it seems to me that although at the level of analysis, at the level of policy, a government says, let's make 100 smart cities, there will be a common infrastructure, all of them. At that level, yes, there is a degree of homogenization. But as soon as, you hear one of the great writers speak about Bhubaneswar here, or the city of memories and relationships and associations that they raise, immediately makes that even the most humble street come alive. A single room in a building suddenly has a new meaning. I think I think it's nice that increasingly these things are marked out and people know. This writer lived there. The same as in Bombay. Manto lived there. This is where Faiz spent a day. That sort of thing. So to me, these are the wonderful things about cities, and perhaps I have a map for them much more for Delhi and Bombay than Bhubaneswar.
That's interesting. So Chandrahas, I actually want to switch gears into even heavier topics which you have referenced in your novels.
Yes.
But before we do that, indulge me please.
Yes.
I have planned a little rapid fire round for you. And the rules of the game are that you cannot take too long over the answers, and you cannot give politically correct answers like both the options or neither of the options. So basically pick one.
Is this another of those recent like coffee with currants?
No, don't worry. We don't want to end your career at all. But anyway, there are some young people I see in the crowd who might want to know these things.
I see.
What do you think about certain things?
All right.
So in a short phrase or word, the best thing about Bhubaneswar?
The parks and gardens and the trees.
Okay. Best thing about Delhi?
This is a very difficult, perhaps the most difficult of all the questions, because they're both important in many ways. I think, shall I tell you, there are different years in which I love them one or the other more. I think this is a more truthful answer than any one. And just recently, I love Arzi the Dwarf more because Although Clouds is only a year old. Because I don't think many people know this, my mother has made a very beautiful translation of it in Odia, and it's coming out next month.
That's great.
Manu Das Shuzia is publishing it as Dowry Books, and actually, I don't know whether you will have to answer this, Sampad, since you have asked me so many questions. Is it a sign of egotism or a compliment to another writer when you laugh at your own jokes, but they are in a different language which your mother has put together? So I'm not sure.
On another day. Today we are asking you the questions.
But just recently, actually I've been listening to my own book in Odia, and to me this is one of life's great collaborations. It's not possible until both sides have become at least 30 or 35 years old, which in my case like now I've reached, and so many things about life become less good as you grow older. But there have to be some compensation, and to me I think this is the fact that both my mother and I can be writers in the same space now, and we can discuss what is the right Odia word, or even I can sometimes find out what is the right Odia word for something, and we can discuss text and be co-creators of a text is something that's why just recently I've heard a lot of Arzi.
Chandrahas, thank you for being such a sport, and while I don't have a hamper for you, genuinely you are invited for dinner tonight. We'll exchange addresses at the end of the session.
That's very sweet. Dinner is better than hampers. I think hampers are goods, dinner is emotion.
Thank you very much. I'd like to invite you at this point to read an excerpt of either of your novels, and if you could talk to the audience a little bit about them.
Okay. I will... why don't I read? I think one of the nice things about writing books is that sometimes things can become characters, and we all have objects which we love irrationally. And in Arzi the Dwarf, there is a character called the Barber. This has nothing to do with the Mughal emperor, but it's a German machine, a projection machine called the Bauer, which, the Indian tongue doesn't do vowels like that very well. So people start calling it the Barber because, over time, and Arzi also thinks of it as the Barber. And he is much smaller than this big projection machine, which is like clamped into the ground. So the image is of him working against this big elephant-like machine. And what I've always loved about the cinema is that some beams of light become reality. And this is what Arzi himself feels is his great treasure. That he's in charge of the great beam. The great beam is something like for him, the equivalent of the diya is for the priest. That it is a source of light that makes life come alive. And I'm going to read a page from midway through the book where Arzi is thinking about how the cinema is going to close down and what will happen. For 30 or 40 years, that projection machine has been broadcasting films 4 times a day. When that stops, what happens? Arzi stood with his face pressed to the edge of the darkness for a long time, looking at the doomed motes of golden light flutter out like fireflies. The great beam, what a miraculous thing it was. As he never tired of reminding those who thought movie projection was no different from selling soap or making entries in a ledger, the xenon lamps of the barber were so powerful that they took a picture the size of a passport photograph and threw it out onto the screen magnified to 3,000 times its original size. The barber's throw was 150 feet. It was hard to throw a cricket ball that far, and here the thing being thrown was something weightless. The moving, talking figures of the big screen, brighter, sharper, more real than reality itself. They were actually nothing but light on a black ribbon. He loved the great machine. He'd always had since the time he had first come up to this room at the age of 13, on a special request from his mother on his behalf, and had been initiated into its wonders by Firoz. The sound of the reel coursing inside the barber was like the sound of the thought inside his brain whenever. And soon, I think projection will not be an art anymore. You load the file and it comes out, and there's nothing more to be done. You might adjust the focus. So in this case, though, I think RZ has a very personal view of Bombay and a very personalized view of his neighborhood. And within that, he has a certain respect as the projectionist. So the sense of losing his job is connected up to his loss of status, not just as a worker, but as a human being. And to properly express that, it couldn't, one couldn't give a very theoretical imagination of a larger picture of what is happening in the world of jobs in India today. It had to be a very personalized experience that combined the feeling of being cheated by the world and being very small, then having that hurt redeemed or solved by being given the cinema to work in, and then having that taken away. That was the narrative arc of the story, and that's what I wanted to remain faithful to. That was his experience of what was going on. That something very close to him is just very like someone dying. So that's that's the level that I want. Of course, it's not exactly fate. If one were to widen the frame of the story, other cinemas would be closing down Bombay at the same time. But since we're in the story of RZ the Dwarf, that's where it had to stay.
Let's go back to Clouds. In Clouds, you have briefly referenced caste,
yes,
but it's mostly restricted to what do old people think about caste and what not the other, perhaps younger, more urban characters think about caste. So, as an author, what has been your observation about caste? Do young and more urban people not think about it?
Well, I don't think one could say they don't think about it, they do. Or one could say that perhaps one of the interesting features of caste is that even when you don't think about it, you kind of reproduce the structures of caste. So it doesn't matter whether you actually dissent or agree at a very personal level. Unless you actually take very strong steps to think through the entire issue, you still behave in more or less an automatic fashion by marrying people within the same caste, or perhaps the answer to your question is in the matrimonial pages of Sunday newspapers. But in Clouds, the question was how to juxtapose three kinds of imagination in Odisha today. One, not necessarily to say that any one of them is particularly bad, only that when they come together, they present certain kinds of problems. And I had to do that in the space of half the book, because the other half was Farad's story. So, Ija and Ui, which is what Ravi calls them, for Aja and I, for them, they live in early 20th century India. Nothing that has happened in the Republic ever since has greatly changed their view of the meaning of life. It may be that they have to assent to certain structures, we are now a democracy, but in the heart of hearts, they still live in that old Odia hierarchical world where it's quite clear what Brahmanas do and how they live and how the world is set up. And within that, they're surprised, why is their son wanting to mix with tribals? And why does he want to go for them asking for their vote, which is kind of already saying that it doesn't matter in the world, when the truth is he should be the highest of the high, as a very high-born Brahmin. And so within the family there is this tension which they directly don't speak about. The only person who works it through his head is Robbie, who is the tribal boy who has lived with the son and knows how exactly he thinks. So in a way, Rabi shows up how the family don't really understand each other. And I felt this would be like an interesting kind of metaphor for the Indian family today, where all young people will know. Maybe I'm neither exactly young or exactly old relative to you, but you can speak about some things to your family, and somehow it's never quite told to you in specific terms, you can't bring up some other subjects, and even when you do, you can bring it up if the answer is within a certain field, and if it's not, then you have to keep it secret as much as possible. And this, I've always been interested by these silences and unspoken adjustments as much as anything that you might share. And I felt in this way, caste would be caste and linked with it the idea of freedom, of politics, of independence, of agency. All this could be brought in a certain line through the experience of the Oriya world with which I was familiar.
You know, let's stay on clouds for a while. You have dealt with electoral democracy because one of your characters, the old couple's son you just spoke about, has gone to Odisha to fight an election. So I found the premise very interesting that a candidate has parachuted himself, in a manner of speaking, to represent a community to which he does not belong to. And I thought that there was scope for a lot of tension. What kind of transactions might have taken place? But in the book we get a sort of a removed account of what might have happened there. Was that again a conscious choice on your behalf to give us a slightly distant account of this playground of possibilities?
Since you asked me this, I'm wondering, how did you, when you were reading it, what did you make of the character of Bhagwan Bhai? Did you feel he was, that there was something malevolent about him, or that he was well-intentioned but he hadn't quite got the hang of how to hold the entire world together?
No, I actually felt that it was very brave of him to do so, because he wouldn't even have community support, in a manner of speaking. And therefore, did he meet with great disillusionment and he had to continue because it was something he had started doing and he had to see it through?
Well, one of the ideas I was trying to explore there is, are we always going to be stuck at the idea of democracy in the, at a level where the only people who can represent somebody are people from the same group? I mean, I understand as a transitional point, you know, different, this is where we are, and different sides have different interests, and who can explain them but somebody from the inside. And then, as you know, parachuting candidates are not new at all, whether in Odisha or anywhere else. I mean, so much of it depends on wealth. Today, if there are certain people in the country who can win from any one of 543 constituencies, just have to make up their minds where to stand from. Mr. Modi, having no history in Banaras, can win from there. In this case, I wanted to show that this is not a cynical option. Since he's really interested in their lives, and he has some contacts in Bhubaneswar and he has some access to the corridors of power, it's clear that if their voice has to be given the space it deserves, it needs the kind of supporter in a high place. And for Bhagavan himself, this is an extension of his life as an Oriya person. That he's had one kind of life being a person in Bhubaneswar, makes TV serials, and he likes laughing at people around him, and also laughing at the fact they don't understand. And so he has a very ironic life. He wants something to believe in, and this is the cause that he had found. So in that sense, it relieves a psychic need of his to work for justice in some field, and then it's clear he loves Ravi very much, and there's just some genuine rapport where, all this is explained in the book, where he says that for the first election is when I fight, after that I'll give it over. I'm a transitional figure in the journey from powerlessness to power. And I felt, because I'd spent so much time in South Odisha, I could see so many tribal women who now stand for elections in panchayats, and it's clear if they moved and tried to fight at a higher level, they would not succeed. So what we are seeing is the kind of the unfolding of the shape of democratic Indian history. And within that space, I wanted to make different figures come alive, So it's not clear whether Bhagwan's plan is for Ravi to base his hair in the future. But is that Ravi's plan for himself, or is that where he ends up? That is the tension in the book. But this is one way of bringing, and then Bhagwan's parents have no interest in this world at all. So once you have those three layers, the ironies and the contradictions of the situations become apparent, and I felt that's what makes the story become more complex with each chapter. And they are interlocking chapters, so every time you come back to the character, something new has to happen so that you feel you're moving forward. So what I'm trying to say in answer to your question is, when you write novels, you have to put together different combinations of thematic and narrative needs into certain configurations.
You mentioned Mr. Modi in your answer.
Yes.
Mr. Modi also happens to find a place in clouds.
Yes.
One of your principal characters, Farhad Bilimoria, he attends a rally by then Gujarat Chief Minister Narendra Modi. So this sets us up for the question, what do you think the impact of a personality like Narendra Modi is going to be on fiction written in India?
Well, at one level, somebody like the Prime Minister is great material for fiction. In a way, he's a bachelor like Bhagwan is, and he has some distant idea of service, some of which, which some Indians don't understand what he's up to. But within the frame of the book. What I wanted to do was, actually I haven't made up a speech for him. This is a translation of a speech he actually gave in Gujarati, and so that points out to the date of the story being 2011. That's when he gave the speech. I've written that in acknowledgements. In one sense, I would say the kind of political imagination of the BJP means that all Indian stories become narrower. And so there is a specific need. If you read Nayanthara Sehgal's the speech that she wasn't allowed to give last week, I think it nails it bang on. Here's an Indian writer who understands, a fiction writer who understands the issues at stake in reducing the Indian imagination to one set of realities. And this petty violence, the way the thuggery, the attacks on artists, this cannot be part of a vibrant civilization. You cannot develop have vikas at some economic level without having vikas in all other levels of the spirit. And so I didn't want to, since the book was not about this is not a theme I could take head on, but I think one of the very nice things about novels is that you can have a center of the room which you focus on, and then when you play a light over the corners, in different spaces you can see other side stories going on. And in presenting a speech where he speaks not about Hindus or Muslims but about the Parsis, who are in every other way, a marginal community because of their size, I felt that would kind of throw a light on, and from the point of view of 2011 to his future as the Prime Minister of India. If somebody thinks like this now at this age, at this stage, what would he do 5 or 6 years later? And then the reader joins the dots. I don't have to do it. They compare this kind of thinking where everybody has to go back to their home. In Modi's speech in the past, he should try and go back to Iran. And so I put it together as if that were to be the case, then all Indians, half of India would have to go back to all different parts of the world. And that was my thinking right there, that this is I have to say, in another way, the Prime Minister is very interesting material for fiction because in some sense he's also a great wordsmith. Separate from the ethics of some of the things he says or the politics of it, it's clear that he's very gifted in words and that his command of, let's say, prose rhythm and of language is exceptional, and that's part of the reason of his appeal. So in a way, as a character, he's very ideal to be written up.
In Clouds, you've continued to make very interesting commentaries about democracy. I'll read to you one of my favorite lines from the novel.
Yes.
If you could talk a little about that. So this is when Bhagavan has won the election and he goes to the Odisha Legislative Assembly. He observes the other MLAs who have been elected and he says to himself, you imagine the just order of wise citizens, then you validate the buffoonery of a cartload of clowns. Is this a view you share yourself? Is it meant for the book? Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Sometimes when you look at what goes on in Parliament, it's hard not to think of other things. But let me find the passage you're talking about. What page was it? Oh,
I haven't noted that down.
It's not a view I share myself. Actually, if you, within the context of the book, what Bhagwan himself is arguing is that it's politics that is changing India and that democracy has ushered in a kind of transformation of Indian society in 70 years that the previous millennium of Indian history has in some ways not been able to acquire. So these observations are set within the context of his expectations of what he was going to find in the future Parliament, and you realize he's very much a loner even there, and that's why he begins to feel ever more that he's missing his closest companion to whom he could say all these thoughts, which is Ravi.
One more interesting aspect, this is almost like a revelation you give us about democracy, is when Bhagavan realizes that as a candidate, it was very easy to take on the corporation, level all sorts of allegations. But now that he has been elected, to indict the corporation within the existing set of Indian laws, you mentioned PESA, you mentioned Land Acquisition Act, is an altogether difficult task. Tell us a little bit about that kind of realization.
Well, this is the thing, and this is what I also feel we should all as citizens think about the actual work of the actual work of politics, of lawmaking, is so complex and complicated and requires so much effort that it cannot be shut out of discussions, and sometimes the arguments that you see on television have nothing to do with the minutiae of politics. In that context, I have a lot of admiration for, I don't usually watch a lot of Netflix, but I think the TV series The Crown does a wonderful job of exploring day-to-day issues in politics, not some large ideological issue, but how do people meet when they disagree and what they talk about. And in this case, because we don't pay so much attention to exactly how laws are passed, suddenly we wake up to find one day that things are being done in the name of the new law, and there are clauses and sub-clauses in section 7A or 8C where something has been sneaked in that then takes over where the real intent of the law is. And that's what I didn't want it to be a novel which was so high above that level that it forgot about that. And this is why I wanted to show some part. It's very nice that Bhagwan is very idealistic, but when he actually gets into parliament and sees what has to be done at the level of legal and verbal work, that's when he starts having some second thoughts.
We will end our discussion with this last question, and we'll take audience questions thereafter. As far as your craft is concerned, I remember reading a blog post where you've mentioned the process of writing Clouds, and you went to Iowa and had a very immersive experience in the English language.
Yes.
And then you have to write in English what certain people think in Odia, the two older people and the boy who is in charge of them.
Yes.
How big of a challenge has it been? How have you dealt with it?
But without these challenges, there's no point in writing novels, because no language is uninflected. Even as we speak, you're probably noticing things about my English that seem strange to you or interesting, and I am about you. And within the world of the Indian novel in English, within the world of the Indian novel in English, as writers, we have, and in fact, the world of the Indian novel in any language, as writers, we are faced with the question of how to render different kinds of experience without making it all at the same level. It can't be, there must be enough room in lines, or I stopped at that line or that paragraph. A novel is essentially a form made for communication between a text and a human being. And within that, of course, it would be wonderful if this was reproduced 20,000 times and a book was sold about Bhubaneswar had sold that many copies too. But is it less of a success, or is it less wonderful, or is it less meaningful if that single connect is made? And also your question relates to the world of many Indian languages and whether I include myself in this, unfortunately. As is the younger generation reading more and more in English and leaving the world of Odia behind. And so, could it be that, to add another layer to your question, a novel written about Bhubaneswar in English actually has more readers than a novel written about Bhubaneswar in Odia? Would that be fortunate or unfortunate? In some ways, you could say it could be read by people around the world. In other ways, it loses something about the language of the place. So these are the nuances of the question that I've tried to bring out, rather than answer you directly. I would never discourage somebody from writing about any place, because I feel that's what organizers for
Absolutely.
A very nice venue where we saw the dust come in while we were talking.
Thank you so much. Thank you.